Howdy, gang, and welcome once again to the Duct Tape Studios. I'm Jeff MacLeod, your host, here at the Gaming Gang channel. Thanks for joining me once again. Today, I am going to share my review of Pendragon 6th edition from Chaosium Inc. This is written by the late, great Greg Stafford with Jeff Richard. Artwork is provided by Mark Smiley, Andrei Fedosov, Eric Hotz, Jaime Garcia Mendoza, Josep Perez, Eleanor Peteria, Agatha Petit, Dimitar Stoyanov, John Sumro, and Wicked Duel LLC. And I do apologize. I guarantee I have mispronounced some of those names outside of Wicked Duel LLC. This 254-page hardcover is arriving in stores this week, June 12th to be exact, and it carries an MSRP of $49.99. Now, if you order from Chaosium Inc., you do receive the PDF absolutely free. The PDF alone is not available yet, but I am going to take a guess. It's going to carry an MSRP of around $24.99 when it arrives on Drive-Thru RPG on June 12th or thereabouts. All that said, let's swing on over to the other camera because here I've got the 6th edition of Pendragon. Couple of things I want to mention before we get stuck in. First of all, my friends over at Chaosium Inc. were kind enough to provide me with this review copy. But neither I nor anyone else affiliated with the Gaming Gang has received any other sort of compensation for me to share this review with you. These days, it's very important you know that. We're also not going to look at each and every page of this book, but I do want to give you a very good feel for what you're going to find inside this core rulebook. All right, let's jump on in. First thing we're going to take a peek at is the credit page, because there were a lot of people who worked very hard to bring 6th edition Pendragon to the public. So we'll give credit where credit is due. If you're not familiar with Pendragon, it is a role-playing game that's built on the legend of Camelot. King Arthur, Merlin, Knights of the Round Table. This is a game that is inspired by the legends of King Arthur. So tales like Le Morte d'Arthur or The Once and Future King. This is not looking to simulate any historical period by any stretch of the imagination. So this does take place during the Pendragon chronology. We should see the Great Pendragon campaign arrive for 6th edition Pendragon, which is phenomenal. At least for 5th edition, it was just fantastic. These are the periods that are covered in the campaign, as well as other volumes that are on the horizon that are planned for 6th edition Pendragon. Something I want to address right off the bat, because I know there are people out there whinging about it and complaining about it. There are female knights in 6th edition Pendragon. And I know there are folks out there who are not happy about it. They're complaining about it. And they say, well, it's not historically accurate. I got to be honest, that argument holds absolutely zero water because this is not made to be historically accurate. This is a fantasy role-playing game. This is based on the legends of King Arthur. So if you're talking about historical accuracy, for one, you wouldn't even have an Arthur because the personages that some scholars think was the basis of the legend of King Arthur, their name wasn't Arthur. It was Arturius or Artur or any number of pronunciations I have heard. Is the warlord, not king, the warlord who would have inspired the legend of King Arthur. We would not have knights in shining armor. We would have knights in boiled leather. And we wouldn't have Camelot. Because at that historical point in time that warlord lived, they did not build with stone. They built with wood. So you would not have a castle. So in my opinion, it's just kind of ridiculous for people to be up in arms about there being female knights in Pendragon 6th edition. But it's your game table. If you don't want to have female knights, no one is going to force you to. So let's talk about the game system itself. Pendragon is built on the basic role-playing system, which powers the vast majority of the Chaosium Inc. role-playing games. But instead of rolling percentile dice, you'll roll 20-sided dice. And there are two kinds of dice that you roll for Pendragon, 20s and D6s. That's it. And I should point out, these are the dice that came with the fantastic Pendragon starter set. If you have not checked out my review, by all means, take a peek because it is awesome. So as far as the production quality of the book, really, really well done. Love the maps. I love the vast majority of the artwork. I got to mention, there is an artist, so I'm not going to name, that there is some artwork that pops up from them throughout the book that's not necessarily bad. It's just sort of ho-hum. And I'm kind of like, kind of surprised that that's included in this. But I am not going to mention, as we're paging through, if we happen to land on a page featuring that person's art, I'm not going to say anything because I'm not trying to pick on that artist. I'm just mentioning that throughout, really like a lot of the artwork, especially the art that we get for the various chapters. It has a very contemporary look to it. It's almost a stained glass look, which I love. And of course, we get kind of woodcut looking artwork. This does not have a uniform art style. Just want to mention that for you. Now we get into a lot of detail about creating your player knight. That is the role that is available to players. Players are not taking on the roles of ladies in waiting or magicians or the court jester or anything like that. The players take on the roles of knights. And this core rulebook will break down what is the responsibility of a knight. What is the responsibility to the lord that they have? What is their responsibility to the king? Now, it is possible that the players might take on the roles of squires who are about to be knighted, but for the most part, your players are going to take on the roles of knights. Now, I'm going to use a pre-generated character from the starter set to give you an idea of some of the important aspects of the game. So we've got our characteristics, otherwise in most role-playing games known as your attributes. We do not have an intelligence attribute. That is just the intelligence of the player. And if there's something going on that the player character should know because they live within that society, the game master is going to just tell the player. It's not like you have to roll to see if you know that or understand that. How do I put spurs on? No. Don't have to worry about that at all. So we've got size, dexterity, strength, constitution, and appeal. We do also have some derived statistics from these also, like hit points is size and constitution combined. So we got hit points and wounds. I'll talk about this when we get into the combat. So we're going to have skills, we have traits, and we have passions. So skills are going to be very similar to any other basic role-playing game that you may have played from Chaosium Inc., say RuneQuest, or my personal favorite, Call of Cthulhu. Like I said, instead of rolling percentile dice, you're rolling a 20-sided die. So if you roll lower than your number, it's a success. Same thing for characteristics. Now, if you roll the exact number, that is a critical success. If you roll higher, it's a failure. If you roll a 20, it's not necessarily a critical failure, but it could be a fumble. You could have some complications arise. But rolling a 20 doesn't necessarily mean, oh my gosh, something horrifyingly bad is going to happen. So we do have our skills, non-combat, and then our combat skills. Now, I'm sure there are a lot of folks out there who are curious, what's different about 6th edition Pendragon than 5th edition Pendragon? I'll be very honest, I am not all that well versed in 5th edition Pendragon. I picked up original Pendragon when it came out. I picked up the 2nd edition of Pendragon. And then I really didn't take a peek at Pendragon much in the years between the 2nd edition and 5th edition. I had read 5th edition Pendragon way back in the day, didn't run it or anything like that. So, to my knowledge, the changes in 6th edition Pendragon are relatively minor mechanically. So there are some skills that are no longer applicable. Romance, as an example, is gone. Some of the combat skills have been combined. So you don't have a flail skill. You don't have a mace skill. You have one-handed hafted weapon skills, two-handed hafted, and so forth. So some of the skills have been dropped and others have been combined. Also, to my knowledge, some of the ambiguity of some of the rules have been cleaned up. So as far as I understand, Pendragon 6th edition is supposed to be the ultimate edition of this role-playing game as written by Greg Stafford. And, little spoiler alert, I think Chaosium has really pulled that off. I'll talk about that when I share my final thoughts. Now, something that some people out there have a misconception about with Pendragon are traits and passions. And one of the complaints I have heard from people who probably have never played Pendragon is that the traits and passions hamstring the player into role-playing their characters a certain way or in certain ways. The reality, in my opinion, is that the traits and passions actually really help the player to role-play a character because we know the personality traits of that character. We know what drives that character. Now, all the knights in the game, doesn't matter how honorable they are or not, are all seeking glory. So that is a huge deal with the player characters, is achieving glory, doing things that get noticed. But there will be times that a game master is going to ask the player to roll against a trait or a passion. Use an example here. Let's say Sir Clarion is in combat and he's defeated an NPC who he hates. Let's say he hates Saxons. That's kind of common. And he's a merciful person for the most part. He leans towards mercy. So maybe the player is going to let the defeated Saxon live. So what the game master will do is say, okay, so I want you to roll against merciful. Player's going to roll that 20-sided die. If they roll under 13, then they would let the Saxon live. Now, if they roll a 13, then they're really doing something merciful. Maybe they allow that Saxon to leave and give them a couple of coins for their trouble or something, right? Something really above and beyond. But let's say that the player rolled a 15. So these traits, we have two sides of a coin. So as an example, chaste, lustful, forgiving, vengeful, honest, deceitful, so on and so forth. So the opposite of merciful is cruel. So the player rolled a 15. Does that mean now they have to be cruel? No. So what they would do now is they would roll their 20-sided die. And if they are hoping to allow this defeated Saxon to live, they're going to want to roll higher than 7. If they roll higher than 7, then they get to role play the character however they would like. If they decide, hey, you know what? I am going to kill them, they can. That's fine. But if they want them to live, they can do that as well. Passions are very similar, although we do not have like the flip side to a coin. So as far as Sir Clarion here, one of his main passions is honor, and then fealty to his king, love for family, devotion to God. He's not very devoted to God. Station in life, hospitality, chivalry. So we have all these different passions. So different characters are going to have different passions. Honor is a given. They all have honor. And funny enough, the traits and the passions can change. So you notice we've got boxes here. We've got boxes by the traits, boxes by the passions, boxes by our skills. The one thing that does not change are your characteristics. So if something important took place where you were rolling on a skill or a trait or a passion, you're going to check that because at the end of the adventure, you're going to see if that value has changed. Like I said, some people have a misconception that the traits and passions force you to only play your characters in a certain way. That is not the case. But as I mentioned early in this review, this is inspired by the Arthurian legend. And if you are familiar with any of the stories of Camelot and the Knights of Camelot, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Le Morte d'Arthur, the Once and Future King, just pulling these off the top of my head. I have read them, so that's why I'm saying this. Think about it. These are people who are ruled by their passions. They live big lives. They are not living quiet lives of isolation. Not at all. And I've got to say, the rule system for Pendragon, in my opinion, really draws upon those core aspects of the Arthurian legend and puts it right there at the game table. When you're playing Pendragon, you feel like your characters are part of the Legend of Camelot. You really do. Far better, once again, in my opinion, than any other role-playing game that's on the market. And that's not only with 6th edition, but prior editions to Pendragon as well. So we'll get a big section here about traits and passions. Here, I want to show you that artwork I was talking about. So here's an example of the chapter artwork that has a very contemporary feel to it. It's got that look, almost looks like it could be stained glass. Absolutely love it. I think this is fantastic. Production quality of this book is awesome. Paper stock, nice and thick. I have to laugh because it's a different stock than what we see with most of the Chaosium books. And I'm kind of wondering if they were going for sort of a parchment feel because it is matte paper, nice and thick. And if that's what they were shooting for, they achieved that effect pretty nicely. So as far as binding and everything, this book is going to hold up really well at your game table. It's got a couple of bookmarks. So anyway, so we're into traits and passions, and this is going to break down everything you need to know as a player and game master about the different traits, the different sides of the coin to those traits, as well as different passions. Really well done. There are some really great examples in here also as far as utilizing these mechanics during the game, using examples of NPCs or supposed fictional player characters facing a certain challenge and so forth. But as you can see, a lot of page space is devoted to these traits and passions so that the players and game master understand that core concept to Pendragon 6th edition, because it is the traits and passions that make Pendragon what it is. They really do. Without the traits and passions, you're looking at a game that would just be essentially basic role-playing with a theme of King Arthur. So we also get skills. So same thing, we're going to get a breakdown of the various different skills. I will say that unlike other basic role-playing games, that this is not where we have dozens upon dozens of skills. The skills are pretty broad, especially now with the 6th edition, dropping some of the skills and combining some of the skills also. I got to say, this piece of artwork here, for a second I thought, oh, it's a Waterford. And I was like, well, no, that's not a Waterford. But I absolutely love this piece here. I think that is so nicely done. Really, really cool. So we get all the information about different skills. So horsemanship, hunting, industry, different modifiers that can be applied to these skills. because there are positive and negative modifiers that will be added or subtracted from your 20-sided die rolls too. So as you can see, quite a few pages devoted to the skills. Then we get aspirations. And as I mentioned, the big deal with the knights is gaining glory. So we've got honor and we also have glory. Honor can rise and fall. So you can have glory with no honor. Now, as far as glory, you only gain glory. You never lose glory. But we've got all these different rules as far as changes to your glory, gaining glory, various different glory awards that will take place. So as an example, being a Knight of the Round Table is going to provide you with a ton of benefits, including glory. There's also info about how to gain and lose honor in here as well. So we get into combat, and combat is not actually all that complex. It's kind of funny because you would think a game like this from a designer who created RuneQuest with hit location and locations having different hit points and armor on various different locations. And I don't want to say an exceptionally crunchy combat system, but a moderately complex combat system would aim for the same thing in a game where it's battling knights and battling bandits and things like that. Not so much. So as far as combat, as long as the knight is not mounted, you can move or you can take an action. If you are mounted, you get to move and take a combat action. So we get a breakdown of the combat round. Here's the actions that are available. For mounted or unmounted, attack, call squire, claim a prisoner, defend, disarm, evade, mount up, pick up, reckless attack, self-sacrifice, study, withhold damage, zigzag. And then, of course, we're going to get a breakdown of what each of these actions actually are. Exclusively unmounted, dodge, don armor, which reality is don armor is going to take more than just a single combat round. Hook and set spear. Spears are very effective against mounted units. Exclusively mounted, control mount, mounted charge, trample. And then we also have brawling, bare hand attack, escape, grapple, and slam. So those are different actions. We get a breakdown of melee combat as well as missile combat, unarmed combat. But here's just a breakdown of the various different actions. So the way Pendragon 6th edition handles opposed rolls is that both players roll dice, and that is the same with combat. The attacker and defender both will roll a 20-sided die. So if the attacker rolls less than their combat skill, then that's a success. If they roll equal to that number, just like anything else, that is a critical success. Same thing for the defender. So the attacker could roll a critical and the defender could roll a critical, and that becomes a tie because criticals equal out. Now, you could fail. You could roll a 20, which could be a fumble, could drop your weapon, could break your weapon. So in combat, a 20 means something bad's going to happen. And what will happen is, depending on what's taking place with various different actions, it's going to tell you, okay, what was a critical success? What was the success? What was the failure? What happens if you rolled a 20? So if both players roll a success, then what you're looking at is who's got the higher roll. That's how opposed rolls work in Pendragon. So if I happen to have a skill of 14 and I'm rolling against somebody who had a skill of 10 and I rolled a 3 and they rolled a 9, they're the winner. Even though my skill is higher, their roll is a higher success. Really interesting and actually very easy to wrap your head around. So what will happen is if you are successful, then you're going to roll 6-sided dice for damage. Each weapon has a damage rating. Different actions you take are going to modify that. Your strength modifies that. So what you're going to do is you will roll damage, and then you are going to subtract the armor value of your target, and what's left over is the damage they take. Now, it's possible that if that character takes damage higher than their constitution, that is a major wound, and they are knocked out of action. They're not necessarily killed. They're just knocked out of action. Maybe they're stunned. Maybe they're knocked unconscious. Maybe their morale is broken, what have you. They are no longer in the fight. Now, every time you take damage, as long as it's not your constitution or higher, you take a wound. And what you'll do is you're going to note these wounds on your character sheet, because if you survive combat, and combat is lethal in Pendragon, characters die, I don't want to say relatively easily, but it can happen. So you could see a player get one shot and it's a mortal wound and they're out. That does happen. As long as that damage did not meet or exceed your constitution, you're just going to take a wound, and those wounds can be healed after combat. So first aid can be applied to each wound, and the player character can gain back some hit points. Now, it's very possible for a character or NPC to continually take wounds and hit 0 as far as hit points without ever achieving a major wound. If you hit 0 hit points, then you are mortally wounded and you are dying. And first aid needs to be applied soon. If not, that character is going to take a dirt nap. So all in all, pretty easy. Now, there are some rules as far as knocking people over, because there is shock. So that is actually going to be your size in some respects. Sometimes you're actually going to roll against dexterity if you're going to be knocked over. So a few different kind of extra steps in combat to see if you're knocked off your feet or you're dismounted if you happen to be on horseback. So keep in mind, there are also a variety of modifiers, both positive and negative, in combat too. Some of them are brought into play based on what your combat action happened to be. So we get a chapter about weapons. So we get our different weapons: melee weapons, brawling weapons, missile weapons, and thrown weapons. We get armor, so it's going to get into detail about the various different types of armor. But once again, unlike, say, RuneQuest, you don't have to worry about the location of armor. You just have an armor protection value of the armor you're wearing, possibly a shield, if you're wearing a helm, and so forth. We have barding for horses, because horses can also take damage. So we get a chapter about horses. It's a short chapter. Injuries and health. So as I mentioned, for every wound, you can have first aid applied to your player character. Now, unlike many role-playing games, you don't want just anybody applying first aid, because things can get bad. So you actually want somebody who is relatively competent in first aid to be treating your characters. There's also surgery that can take place. So what will happen is that you've got your different wounds. First aid is applied to them as long as it's within 24 hours. That's fine, which is one of the ways that the game tries not to focus on first aid taking place constantly during a battle unless someone's mortally wounded. Once you have had first aid applied, then what you're looking at is a relatively lengthy period to regain the rest of your hit points. So this is not a role-playing game where a player character will be an inch within death and then go to a monastery, and 2 days later, they're completely healed. That is not going to happen. Now, it's also important to keep in mind, Pendragon is a generational game. And what I mean by that is the way Pendragon is designed is that your player characters will have an adventure every year. So you have an adventure. We also have a winter turn, which is kind of your downtime, which we have a variety of different mechanics there as far as what's going on in that player character's life during that period of time. But as far as adventuring, player characters have one adventure a year and then they age. So the Great Pendragon campaign, which I'm sure we will see for 6th edition Pendragon, is awesome. And it runs the length of the Legend of Camelot. So it begins prior to Arthur's birth and it runs through Arthur's death. And what you see is that you'll start off with one player character and then they establish a family and possibly they're ennobled and they own property and they have a manor and so on and so forth. And then they have a child and the child grows up and the child squires and then the child becomes a knight. So it's really, really interesting and very, very cool. Once again, I've pointed out before, Pendragon is not just your typical fantasy role-playing game. It is very, very unique in the approach that it takes. So we'll also have some chapters about wealth, and we have, which I thought was kind of cool, a heraldry generator. I thought that was really nice. And then our character sheets, as you notice, a little bit different than the character sheet we saw for the pre-gen. And that is what we'll find inside the Pendragon core rulebook. Do want to mention, I also received the Grey Knight, which is a Pendragon campaign. I am hoping to have this reviewed tomorrow because I want to have my reviews out for both the core rulebook and the Grey Knight prior to these going on sale, so you can make an informed buying decision regarding the core rulebook as well as the Grey Knight. All right, let's swing on over to the other camera because I'm going to share some final thoughts and give this a review score. So there is a ton I really love about the latest edition of Pendragon. I've always been a fan of the game. I've got to say that the goal in mind from Chaosium Inc. and Greg Stafford and Jeff Richard was to present a new edition of Pendragon that cleaned up any issues people had with rules, make sure everything was crystal clear, and probably kind of streamline the game a little bit. And I've got to say that they've done a phenomenal job of doing that. Interestingly enough, though, you'll notice this says core rulebook. Now, if you go and take a peek online and do a search for Pendragon 6th edition, you're going to see a lot of images of this book cover, but it doesn't say core rulebook. It says player's handbook. And I must admit, this does come across more as a player's handbook because there's no bestiary. We don't have any stat blocks for NPCs. We don't get stat blocks for any of the famed knights or Arthur, Guinevere, Lancelot, Tristan, nothing. So I'm kind of surprised by that. Now, of course, I know there's more books for Pendragon on the horizon. I completely understand that. But this core rulebook is kind of built so that you're going to play published adventures because the core rulebook itself will make it a little tricky for game masters to come up with their own tales. Now, interestingly enough, there is a solo scenario section in here, which is kind of designed for players if they miss a session, if they miss an adventure, They just play a solo scenario to kind of catch up as far as glory and things along those lines. Also to kind of keep the fiction going as far as the campaign that you're playing. But there aren't really any rules or sections that are aimed at creating adventures for Pendragon 6th edition. Kind of surprised. So I sort of have the impression that at the last minute, the fine folks over at Chaosium Inc. decided to make this a core rule book rather than a player's handbook. Now, I do know that another book that's going to be coming is, I want to say off the top of my head, the Book of Nobles. And I'm kind of curious if that's going to be sort of the Game Master book. I don't know. But what's in this rule book, I love. I think it's fantastic. I just have to be honest and say the rule book does feel a little bit incomplete because it doesn't have some of that Game Master facing content that I would expect in a core rule book. There's also no introductory adventure. Once again, there is the solo scenario section, but there is no introductory adventure. Of course, there is an adventure in the quick start, which is absolutely free. And we had the starter set, which also has an adventure book. But I would have liked to have seen, even if it was only a few pages long, an introductory adventure in the core rule book as well, thus not forcing a game master to go in, grab the quick start, or go and purchase the starter set, or run out and purchase the Grey Knights just because they need to have a published adventure. So I do have to ding the 6th edition core rulebook for these things. I've also got to say that if you are looking for the ultimate Arthurian role-playing game, you do not have to go off on some Grail quest. All you'll have to do is stop on into your friendly local game store on the 12th or pop on over to chaosium.com and order Pendragon 6th edition, and you will have that in your hands. As I mentioned previously, in my opinion, Pendragon captures the feel of the Legend of Camelot and King Arthur, Merlin, Guinevere, Lancelot, Gawain, and all the rest better than any other role-playing game on the market. And I also believe if you have any interest in playing a role-playing game based on Arthurian legend, then it is an absolute no-brainer. The 6th edition of Pendragon must be in your collection. On a scale of 0 to 10, I give the core rulebook for Pendragon 6th edition a 9 out of 10. It is excellent. Got minor quibbles. That's why it didn't score the 10 out of 10. But even with those quibbles, this is a striking achievement for the late, great Greg Stafford, Jeff Richard, and the folks at Chaosium Inc. All right, that is it for this time out. If you like this video, by all means, please give it a quick thumbs up. Subscribe to the Gaming Gang channel if you haven't already. And if you do subscribe, don't forget, ring that bell. It'll not only let you know when I share videos such as this review and the upcoming review of The Grey Knights. It'll also tell you when my live stream, The Gaming Gang Dispatch, airs Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday evenings right here on YouTube at 7 p.m. Central. Of course, when you're not watching videos on the Gaming Gang channel, be sure to visit thegaminggang.com for all latest in tabletop gaming news, reviews, and a whole lot more you are not going to find here on YouTube. You know the drill. Get your geek on at thegaminggang.com. Thank you very much for watching. Once again, I'm Jeff MacLeod, and until I see you next time, I hope all of you get to enjoy plenty of great gaming with your gang.